Fantastic. Thank you very much, Alex, for inviting us. It's been an excellent opportunity to chat with human rights activists and people interested, as well as meet some other Bitcoiners. Jimmy, we're talking today about who controls Bitcoin. So maybe it's important to talk about, what sets Bitcoin apart from other forms of money that we can use? Like, what assurances does Bitcoin give us that, say, fiat banking cannot?
Well, first of all, can I just say that I'm so glad to be here, and that I never thought as a coder that I'd be speaking at a human rights conference, right? Like that. How did we get here? What the heck? But it's related to the answer that I'm about to give, which is that Bitcoin is apolitical money. And that is something that we don't think much about, because money is so seeped in our system, and we don't realize just how much control it has over us. So to answer the question, basically, all other forms of money have some central controller, some agenda, some politics involved in it. And that tinges all of our interactions, not just with other businesses and things like that, but with each other, right? Like a large part of why people screw each other over is because the incentives are just completely misaligned. So you have, things in the fiat system like, the ability to take out enormous leverage on positions if you happen to be an investment banker. This is, money printed ex nihilo for the sake of, the few that are on Wall Street that have access to this stuff, and they're able to get very rich off of that stuff. And that is an injustice that's not obvious, and it's hidden from us, and it's purposefully not taught in schools. But once you study this stuff, you realize it is very much political. And having an apolitical money, something that is decentralized, that nobody controls, that is a huge gift to the world. And it helps everybody out, because it allows you to make decisions without having, without having all these agendas behind it. Because like it or not, we are on sort of this dollar standard, a dollar hegemony all over the world since about 1944 with the Bretton Woods Agreement. And that means that as a result, a lot of the world has had to follow the US's lead in whatever it is that the US wants to do. And it's been, in some ways, good, but in many other ways, very bad. And it allows certain people to benefit at the expense of others. In any other era, it would just be called theft, but it's not so called right now. But the big difference between fiat and Bitcoin is that fiat money is entirely political, and it has a lot of agendas, and people that sometimes mean well, sometimes don't mean well, but they ultimately are doing things that benefit themselves and not at the expense of everybody else. Whereas Bitcoin is fair, it's apolitical, it is decentralized.
Right, and so then probably the obvious question that will come is, well, how is Bitcoin controlled? I mean, you guys are up here talking about 21 million coins, and there's never going to be more than that, but could that ever be changed, right? I'm obviously asking from the perspective of somebody who is maybe new to Bitcoin and trying to learn what exactly secures this thing, what exactly keeps that scarce 21 million cap and the various other rules of Bitcoin that we know and love.
Well, the way in which everything is enforced is within each individual. So anybody that is running a full node is constantly auditing the entire Bitcoin blockchain. So instead of relying on the Fed, instead of relying on central banks or Congress or whoever needs to raise the debt ceiling or whoever is in charge of the Treasury or something like that, we rely instead on software code. And each person that is running their own node is enforcing these rules constantly. With every new transaction that's coming on the network, with each new block, every new page in the ledger, if you want to look at it that way, everything is being validated. Every rule is checked, and everything is made sure to follow the rules that were set from the beginning. And one of those rules, of course, is a strict, non-negotiable 21 million limit. So in theory, you could change it, but that would require the agreement of every node on the network. Because if you decide not to accept it, then that's not Bitcoin for you. And at that point, it's something else. And we have had this happen back in 2017, where a bunch of people decided, you know what, we don't like this particular rule about 1 megabyte blocks. and we're going to change that to 2 megabyte blocks. And they decided, well, we're going to call this Bitcoin, and they called it Bitcoin Cash. And of course, they weren't the only ones. There were like 18 other forks that had some non-negligible value and so on. But very quickly, the market or the rest of the people that were on it decided, hey, you know what? These things aren't Bitcoin. The real Bitcoin is Bitcoin, the one that didn't change any of the rules. And that's how it's, it really, you can't change it unless you get the agreement of absolutely everybody, which is highly unlikely unless, there's some, like emergency or something like that, which we can talk about. But you need absolute consensus because everyone is running their own node. And that is how it is audited. And basically all of the auditors have to agree to change something in order to change anything.
Yeah, excellent. And so, as Jimmy was explaining, it's like when you run this Bitcoin node, it's checking all the rules of Bitcoin. So if an invalid transaction comes, your node just almost doesn't see it. I'm ignoring that. That's not a real transaction. That's not a real block. It's not valid. It does not meet the rules of Bitcoin. And so, as Jimmy, as you were saying, the market selects what Bitcoin is. And as we saw in the block size wars of 2016 and 17, culminating in the Bcash and the No2x movements as well, there was the market deciding what really was Bitcoin. And it was, in a sense, the Bitfinex tokens were one example where they were showing, here's what B1X token and here's what B2X token was. And as an example, the price for B1X was something like 0.85 and the price for the B2X token was 0.15, reflecting that the market very, very much did not agree with this idea that 2X was a thing, despite the many aspects of the ecosystem, so large companies in Bitcoin, large mining pools as well, that were kind of aligned on that side. Despite that, it still didn't come through, didn't it?
Yeah, in that sense, the governance of Bitcoin requiring sort of unanimity and consensus before moving on was really tested there because these were some of the most powerful companies in the industry, right? You had companies like Coinbase and Zappo, I think, BitGo, I think, some others that were all trying to push for this. And combined, they were claiming, hey, we represent all of these users because we have this many people that are our customers and we're going to represent them and this is what they're going to want, whether or not they actually, show it or not. And they were turned back by the market, right? It showed that the users are in charge. The people that are running full nodes are in charge. The people that own the Bitcoins are in charge, and not the miners, not the people that are running exchanges, not the businesses, and in any other sort of governance model, including democracy, if you have people in government and people in business agree on something, it almost always gets done. It's very rare that the people can actually control things, and that's kind of what it showed, and what's one of the most remarkable properties of Bitcoin is that it really is controlled by the users. It is direct democracy in some, well, not even democracy, it's direct unanimity. And the default is you go with the rules that are, and the only way you change it is if you have absolute unanimity across the board.
Yeah, and so let's try to talk out some of the scenarios then for people who aren't as familiar. Let's say hypothetically, developers try to make a change that the users don't agree with. What would happen in that kind of scenario?
Yeah, so say the developers decided, hey, let's not make it 21 million, let's make it 42 million. Let's double the number of Bitcoin that exists. What would happen? Well, first of all, if you're running your own node, you have some software that's already running, and you have no obligation to upgrade. And this is in stark contrast to a lot of coins that have hard forks, right? These are forced upgrades. If you don't upgrade your software, then you are out of consensus with everybody else, and at that point, like you're not checking anything. You're just sort of running old software. With Bitcoin, if you don't have to run any new software. There's nobody forcing you, right? There's no Ethereum Foundation, for example, that says you're out of consensus and you're not the real Ethereum or anything like that. There's no central entity. So that means that if they did propose something like a 42 million limit in a new release of Bitcoin, what would happen is there'd be a lot of users that say, I'm not upgrading to that. I don't agree to this, and they keep running the old software. At that point, the market would decide, okay, well, there's the 42 million coin, there's the 21 million coin. Which one are you going to go with? I would venture to guess that most people would go with the 21 million coin. Although, I mean, you never know, I suppose. But that's how it gets decided, not by sort of like developer diktat, right? Like this is the benevolent dictator model of a lot of open source projects. But it's really decided by the users, the people running the software, the people running the full nodes, the people that are doing the actual auditing. They decide.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's also important to note that developers take that into their mindset as well. So they are cognizant of this. And so if you talk to some of the Bitcoin Core developers, reviewers, maintainers, they are thinking about this as well, because they have a sense of, what do I think they're thinking of a few things. They're thinking, what is the intention of this project, and what do the users want? Because a developer might decide, you know what, this technology might be cool, but I think we wouldn't be able to get the users over the line, and therefore we just won't work on this particular thing. Or we would, let's say, the maintainer is making one of the maintainers of the Bitcoin Core project is saying, oh, this is not in line with what the Bitcoin users would want, and they would proactively stop something before they even packaged that up into the next release, as an example, right?
Yeah, and they definitely understand sort of like the ethic of Bitcoin, or who actually controls it, and they behave in that way, right? They're not going to propose changes like, let's change it to 42 million. That's not something anyone is really going to propose, or if they are, they're going to be almost immediately shunned by everybody. And you have to realize, like, Bitcoin developers are a very diverse group. They are from many different countries, and they have many different political views, and they, like, some of them don't like each other. That's a normal thing. They fight with each other all the time. And it is extremely difficult to get consensus on any coding changes. And in fact, I mean, like Callie or Carl Johan Alm, he worked on like Signet for like a year and a half before it got merged in. And this is just sort of like a testnet thing that he wanted as part of Bitcoin Core, and not necessarily anything as part of consensus. But it took him a year and a half because he was waiting for feedback. He was making sure that he got consensus, and it took that long for people to realize, okay, this isn't going to harm anything. This is beneficial, and that's how it came about. And that was for a non-consensus change, right? Like, imagine any sort of consensus change. There's going to be a lot of discussion, and very likely a lot of people that oppose it. And if that's the case, it's probably not going to get in. And it's the entire project has that ethic, like, at first do no harm, right? Like, don't like try to pick winners and losers. And again, this is in very stark contrast to other projects where they'll be like, you know what, we don't like what you're doing, so we're going to move from proof of work to proof of stake, something like that, right? Like, we don't like what you're doing, so we're going to make this thing more expensive. That's sort of like the governance model of a lot of other projects. Whereas Bitcoin, it's to leave things the way they are, and we'll give people options to do new things. And and that gives room for sort of the innovation and application development on things that the market wants on other layers. So we have this thriving Lightning Network that is doing some amazing things. And there's lots of other layer 2s that are built on top of Bitcoin as well. And this is where people can try different things. And we got like 5 different coin join things and privacy options and things of that nature. That's what you should expect, right? This is the market. It doesn't have to be at the protocol layer, which I think is the right model, because it makes it a lot more steady, a lot easier to predict, and you can plan ahead better as an entrepreneur if you're building on this stuff. So, that's how Bitcoin is designed, basically.
Yeah. So essentially, it's in a way that it's actually difficult to control and change, and arguably that's a feature. But it's not impossible to get a change through. So obviously, the Taproot is an example where a change was designed, implemented, reviewed. There was a lot of work done on this, and actually another interesting example on this as well is that because Bitcoin and Bitcoin Core developers and contributors take this decentralization quite seriously, it was almost like a lot of the code for Taproot was ready, but it was almost at one point nobody wanted to come out and say, here's the activation plan, here's how it's actually going to happen. And now some of that was because of the battle scars of 2017, but that's probably another example there where there is no dictator from on high who says this is how it's going to go and this is the roadmap. Bitcoin Core doesn't even have a roadmap explicitly like that. There are ideas that people are interested to work on, and anybody can contribute, but you still have to respect the intention of the project and still have to make sure that your idea meets the market test of would the users actually run your code?
Yeah, and that's hard for a lot of people to accept, right? Because they're so used to sort of having somebody in charge, having somebody that you can go talk to and say, hey, can you make this change for me? And that's hard to accept because we're used to sort of like decentralized institutions. And a decentralized thing like Bitcoin just works very differently. You don't have roadmaps. A roadmap is basically saying we are going to do this, this, and this. And you can't say that because you don't represent all the users. Yet this is exactly what a project like Ethereum or Monero or whatever your favorite altcoin is, that's what they do. They say, we are going to do this on this quarter, by this release, we should have this feature, and so on. And it's like, well, who makes those decisions? How can you say this is what your users want if the users actually control it, if it's actually decentralized? This proves that those things are centralized. The fact that Bitcoin doesn't have a roadmap, now there are things that people are working on all the time, but there's no guarantee that they get in at all. Taproot's been worked on for years. It was very much in jeopardy. Like earlier this year, it was possible that it wouldn't have activated. There's lots of other things that people have worked on for years that might not get in. Because unless you have consensus, it's not going in. And it's going to, we're always going to err on the side of keeping things the way they are because that is a good property of money, predictability. The ability to say, okay, this is how it's going to be 5, 10, 20 years from now, instead of things constantly changing. And I would argue that is one of the reasons why fiat money is so pernicious, because you can't predict what the central bank is going to do. You can't predict what the government is going to do. And if they change the rules all of a sudden, and I've been told this in like many Latin American and African countries, where basically your savings is wiped out every 7 years. This is like the inverse of like the Jubilee year in the Bible, right? Like it's, instead of wiping out all your debts, it's wiping out all your savings every 7 years or something like that. That is like insane that people go through that, because that makes like planning or entrepreneurship extremely difficult. Whereas with something like Bitcoin, you have predictability, and that's a very, very good thing.
Yeah, so excellent points there, Jimmy. And I think it might be also a good point to compare and contrast a little bit, as you've been doing, with Bitcoin and say the US dollar, altcoins, and even stablecoins. I think stablecoins are another one because, okay, you know what, stablecoins is probably a good one to talk about a little bit, because I can understand that many people who are new to this world of Bitcoin, they can see, oh, look, that thing is super volatile. I would rather just go over here and use my USD Tether or some other, some kind of stablecoin, because it purportedly is a stable value. But there are hidden risks with that. So when we're talking about who controls Bitcoin, well, who controls Tether? Someone can centrally stop your account. Someone can centrally freeze your tethers, can't they? So there are a few examples. Do you have anything you want to add there?
Yeah. So Tether in particular has an actual bank account. So there's a bank account that can get seized by the U.S. government, or we're not really sure where the bank is, and there's a lot of kind of mystery around that. I'm sure they keep that as a trade secret and whatever. But there is actually a bank account, and there's a portfolio and everything that gets managed by somebody. And who knows how they manage it or whatever. It could blow up at any minute, and there is sort of like that systemic risk. Now, a lot of people don't mind that risk, or they think, okay, somebody will bail me out, whether it be Bitfinex or some government or something like that. But I think that's a very fragile way to think, and it's not very robust to systemic shocks. And especially if you live in a country where you've had systemic shocks, like a complete change in government or something like that, those things don't go through. And that's what you want to protect against. And this is why Bitcoin is so powerful, because it is apolitical. It is not tied to any government or entity. And that means that a lot of things can fail, and Bitcoin will chug along. And that's not a property that you find with a lot of different things, and having that ability to save sort of outside of the purview of your government, somebody that can that wants to do things with your money. Well, that's a very powerful thing.
Yeah, and to add to also that is around some of the what people are talking about with DeFi altcoins and things. And basically every few weeks we see there's some big hack, and every few weeks someone's lost $50 million or $100 million on some DeFi hack on an altcoin, and then what happens next is somebody tries to. You have to ask yourself this question: if a government or a regulator came to you and said, "Stop this platform," is there someone out there who could do it?
It's what we would call a single point of failure. If there is a single point of failure, it's not decentralized at all. And I hate this meme that decentralization is a range, and you can be over here or there. No, it's not. You either have a single point of failure or you don't. It's a 0 or 1. If you have a single point of failure, you are centralized. If you don't, you are decentralized. That's basically it. And there are so many single points of failure in something like Ethereum. You can, basically go to the one the one node that's running, or the one foundation, or the one creator, or there's so many ways in which it is very vulnerable to regulation, taxes, confiscation, all the wonderful things that our governments like to do. These are all existential risks, and similar with Tether, right? Like we were talking about, you could have the government seize these funds. You can have the manager of those funds abscond with the money, somehow embezzle it or something to that effect. There are sort of single points of failure. Not that any of these will necessarily happen, but these are risks, and over a long enough timeline, these things have a tendency to blow up, because if you have a single point of failure, well, that will get tested at some point given enough time. And whereas with Bitcoin, you don't have that single point of failure, which means that you have this protection that is sort of outside trusting a third party in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to bear in mind that there are various centralization pressures present. So even in the case of Ethereum, I did a recent episode with Alex B talking about some of these centralization pressures around staking derivatives, the incentives of exchanges. So these are just a few examples, and obviously we're just trying to give everyone a taste of what are some of the things to think about in terms of control and how the system actually operates in practice. So I've only got a couple of minutes left, so if you've got any thoughts there for everyone out there on how to critically assess who controls Bitcoin or whatever project they're looking at.
Yeah, a good sort of mental model for me is all right. Who has the data, right? Who has the data? For something like the U.S. financial system, whenever you go buy something, who has the data? Well, the credit card company has the data. Your bank account probably has the data. The store has the data. And if you're purchasing a lot of different things, the credit card company actually knows quite a bit about you. And if you're not using cash or some other way to privatize your stuff, it's actually kind of creepy how much they know, right? And that's how you know that, okay, that's kind of a single point of failure. If some hacker got into the database of your credit card company and downloaded all the transactions, what would they know about you? How could they use that to exploit something like that? And the thing is, if your government turns evil, they're going to have access to that data because they're going to be able to subpoena it or grab it or do something with it. And if they see you as a political opponent, expose the fact that you like this kind of porn or something, right? Like just anything embarrassing, they will use against you for that reason. And this is why privacy is so important, because if you can figure out where the data, who has the data, and who's that's a good way to figure out if there are any single points of failure on data. The other one is, are there any people that are making decisions that if you disagreed with them, you'd have any recourse, right? Like with Bitcoin, there's lots of recourses, right? Like you can object directly on the mailing list. You can talk about it on Twitter and lots of other places. If you disagree and your argument has merit, you will be heard. Whereas, if Vitalik decides we're going to move to Ethereum 2.0, Not much you can do about that, is there? Right? Like there's no real recourse. I mean, you can complain to Vitalik, but it's Vitalik's decision because it's his coin. So it ends up being sort of, you know, all your arguments are more or less moot, and that's that your ideas are basically not welcome. So I would say those are sort of the two heuristics. Where's the data? And if I have like a complaint on something, like, do I have an effective means of lodging that complaint, basically?
Yeah. All right, well, I think that's about all we've got time for because we've got the next panel up. But thanks, everyone.